I'm here as a critical Kashmir scholar and a member of the Kashmir Scholars Consultative and Action Network, KSCAN. As a scholar, I position myself as an ally, and I carry out my research in collaboration and consultation with Kashmiri scholars and Kashmiri human rights defenders in alignment with the Kashmiri right to self-determination. Today, I want to make the point that the human rights situation in Kashmir has rapidly and dramatically deteriorated following the rise to power in India of Narendra Modi and his Hindu supremacist political apparatus in 2014. Over these past 8 years, we have been witnessing these escalating patterns of restriction, repression, intimidation, and terror in Kashmir unfolding in real time, along with very significant legal and political transformations that have had devastating consequences for Kashmiris and Kashmiri communities. The progression of the human rights crisis in Kashmir tracks from the state's brutal crackdown using pellet-firing shotguns against civilian street protesters in the summer of 2016, through India's abrogation of these key constitutional provisions, granting special status to the state in the summer of 2019, through the widespread use of stringent terrorism laws to silence and repress protesters, journalists, and human rights defenders, especially since 2021. Of course, these dynamics are not new. India's brutal persecution of Kashmiris today and across the past 8 years must be considered as the most recent phase of India's longstanding denial of Kashmiri sovereignty through legal, political, and military occupation of Kashmir since 1947. And any meaningful and substantive interventions from the international community must address these fundamental legal and political realities and must be resolved in accordance with the will of the Kashmiri people. As the human rights situation has become increasingly alarming in recent years, we've seen an increasing pattern of expressions of concern and condemnation from the international human rights community regarding India's policies and practices in Kashmir. And this includes UN special procedures mandates, as well as the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. It also includes international human rights organizations, European and EU bodies, as well as the State Department, USRIF, various representatives and senators, and high-profile candidates for political office in the US. So today I'd like to highlight these responses from the international human rights community to emphasize the point that India has increasingly positioned itself outside of and indeed in opposition to the global community of countries that share values regarding democratic political participation, rule of law, and human rights. In June of 2018, UN High Commissioner Zeid al-Hussein released a groundbreaking report on human rights violations in Kashmir from 2016 to 2018. Now, despite urgent requests from his office, India steadfastly refused to allow official OHCHR observers into Kashmir. So given its lack of access, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights based its report on remote monitoring, relying on human rights documentation that was available in the public domain and using a reasonable grounds standard of proof. Much of this documentation was actually carried out by human rights defenders that were working on the ground in the region, especially JKCCS and Khurram Parvez. And this was the first time in 2018 that the leading UN entity on human rights had issued such a report. The report is highly significant. It calls for both India and Pakistan to cease human rights violations and, quote, fully respect the right of self-determination of the people of Kashmir as protected under international law, end quote. It also calls for the Human Rights Council to pass a resolution to establish a UN-sponsored commission of inquiry into allegations of human rights abuses in Kashmir. The OHCHR issued a follow-up report the following year in June of 2019, just before the abrogation. Since then, High Commissioner Zeid and his successor, High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, have consistently expressed concern about the human rights situation in Kashmir in their public statements and their opening statements at meetings of the Human Rights Council. Now, in the months just following the second report from the OHCHR office, India initiated its elimination of Jammu and Kashmir's special status in the Indian Constitution. Previous speakers have discussed the abrogation of August 2019 in detail. The international human rights community issued substantial responses at that time regarding the communications blackout and the other restrictive measures that were put into place, as well as the unilateral and undemocratic legal and political maneuvers themselves. In the days following the abrogation, a group of UN independent experts issued a public statement expressing immediate concern about the communications blackout, saying, quote, "The blackout is a form of collective punishment of the people of Jammu and Kashmir without even a pretext of a precipitating offense, end quote. And in October 2019, just a few weeks after the abrogation, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a statement of extreme concern at the ongoing human rights violations and urged Indian authorities to unlock the situation and fully restore people's rights. In February of 2021, a series of UN experts issued a statement of concern over the abrogation itself, India's decision to eliminate Kashmir's semi-autonomous status and restrict the participation of minorities in political and other activities. Now, since the abrogation 2.5 years ago, UN independent experts had issued 13 communications to India regarding the human rights situation in Kashmir. And since 2021, India has either refused to respond to these letters or has responded on the condition that their response will remain confidential and not be made public. India has also refused to engage with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on these matters. Now, it's important for us to remember today that there was significant momentum around US intervention at this time following the abrogation in the months between the abrogation and the onset of the pandemic in March 2020. During that time, for the first time, the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation held a hearing on Kashmir, and that was in October of 2019. In November of 2019, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission held another congressional hearing on Kashmir. And at that hearing, co-chair James McGovern of Massachusetts said, quote, "We can never give up on standing for the principle that people have the right to their own self-determination," end quote. Over these past 6 months, the international human rights community has again ramped up its expressions of concern over the human rights situation in Kashmir. And in particular, the arrests of human rights defender Khurram Parvez and journalist Fahad Shah have been met with broad condemnation by domestic and international civil society. Renowned human rights organizations have issued independent and joint statements calling for the immediate and unconditional release of Khurram Parvez. And these groups include Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the International Commission of Jurists, Frontline Defenders, FIDH, the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT, the Civicus Global Alliance, the Rapto Foundation for Human Rights, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawlor, and other UN experts called for Khurram Parvez's immediate release in a joint statement in December. They identified his deprivation of liberty as a form of retaliation and reprisals for speaking out on human rights issues. These special rapporteurs submitted a communication to India that was made public in February, detailing their concerns. In March of this year, 21 members of the European Parliament wrote to Prime Minister Modi, expressing their concern about the treatment of human rights defenders in India. And they noted their special concern over the detention of Khurram Parvez in, quote, "one of the most overcrowded and unsanitary prisons in the country," end quote. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom has added both Khurram Parvez and Fahad Shah to the freedom of religion or belief victims list. And the US State Department 2021 country report on human rights practices in India, which was just released a week ago, outlines a wide array of human rights violations in Kashmir, with attention to the arrest of Khurram Parvez. The human rights crisis in Kashmir has been unfolding for decades, and it continues to deteriorate dramatically every day. And India continues to restrict access to Kashmir by human rights observers, international media, and foreign dignitaries. After the abrogation, the ICRC stopped its humanitarian work in Kashmir as its foreign aid workers were not issued visas. In October of 2019, India refused to allow US Senator Chris Van Hollen access to Kashmir during his visit to the country. In February of 2020, India deported UK Member of Parliament Debbie Abrams, who heads a Kashmir parliamentary group, upon her arrival at the Delhi airport. In the few cases where official visits have been allowed access to Kashmir, the government has closely controlled any movements and their ability to survey the situation on the ground. From 2016 to the present, India has refused to allow access to UN fact-finding missions, prompting the OHCHR to issue these reports on the human rights situation in Kashmir through remote monitoring mechanisms. So in sum, India refuses access to outside observers, intimidates and arrests Kashmiri journalists, activists, and human rights defenders, and criminalizes free expression and dissent. This is the crucial moment for collective mobilization and collective action, not only for Kashmiris, but for all of us who care about human rights. The recent US Summit for Democracy represented, quote, a shared effort to set forth an affirmative agenda for democratic renewal and to tackle the greatest threats faced by democracies today through collective action, end quote. In the spirit of this Democracy Summit, we're asking for leaders from government, civil society, and the private sector, and especially those representatives and senators who might be joining us today, to assess the human rights realities in Kashmir in reference to the shared values framework that supposedly defines the US relationship with India. It has become increasingly clear that India does not value a commitment to democratic political participation, to rule of law, and to human rights. Quite the contrary. Through its Kashmir policy, India has increasingly demonstrated its refusal to counter authoritarianism, promote and protect human rights, and participate in the effort to build a shared foundation for global democratic renewal. Thank you.